I'm Graham Allison, and as director of the Belfer Center, it's my great honor to welcome you tonight to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum and for a very special event. Our two stars and guests tonight are former Senator Sam Nunn and David Sanger, who are sitting right here. Please stand up and we'll welcome you. In the program, you can read more about each of them. Senator Nunn is a legend. He was with his co-author, Senator Dick Lugar, the champion and initiator of the most significant piece of congressionally initiated legislation in the period in the U.S. since World War II, the so-called Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. He was a great chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and in his current incarnation, among his many other activities, he's the president, or he's the chief executive officer of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, an NGO in Washington that's played a major role in putting the whole nuclear issue at the top of the U.S. agenda. David Sanger is the chief correspondent for the New York Times, is a Harvard graduate whom we are extremely proud of, who's active participant here with the Belfer Center, and who's been the principal journalist covering the whole nuclear space over now a significant number of years, including in a book on the Bush administration called The Inheritance. He's a former Pulitzer Prize winner and so forth. The game plan for tonight is a real treat. So, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, this organization that Senator Nunn and Ted Turner founded, and which actually has had a number of programs here before, has produced a new documentary called The Nuclear Tipping Point. And we're going to have a chance tonight to screen that in the half-hour version. There's an hour version, but we're getting just sort of some nuggets from it. And after you've seen the half-hour version, you'll be eager to go see the hour-long version. But given how much time we have, we're going to do the half-hour version. That's step one. Step two, Senator Nunn and David Sanger will come to the podium, and we'll have a conversation here about the documentary and the issues that it raises, which are right, I would say, in the bullseye of the Nuclear Security Summit, if you watched what happened in Washington just 2 weeks ago, and are extremely relevant to what's happening in New York tonight at something called the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which David just came from this afternoon, coming from New York. And then finally, we'll go to the audience where we'll be interested to invite questions, comments, and discussion. So that's the game plan, and let's see the documentary.
I want to introduce this film from the standpoint of a soldier who was taught to use nuclear weapons and as a diplomat who worked hard for their elimination. As a 21-year-old second lieutenant assigned to Germany, one of my first missions was to guard an atomic cannon, a huge machine that ran around Germany on a couple of trucks. A few years later, as a captain, I was taught how to actually employ this weapon and other similar weapons. I was taught how to determine what the blast effects of such weapons would be, how many people would be killed by the blast, how many buildings would be knocked down. I was also taught what the thermal effects would be, how things would be burned, how people would be burned. I was taught about the radiation effects, and I was taught to plot the fallout pattern that would come from the use of nuclear weapons as the dirt was thrown up into the sky and spread out across the landscape. And then I became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1989, and I had 28,000 nuclear weapons under my supervision. And every morning I looked to see where the Russian submarines were off the coast of Virginia and how far away those missiles were from Washington. And I kept track of where the Russian missiles were in Europe and in the Soviet Union. And the one thing I convinced myself of after all these years of exposure to the use of nuclear weapons is that they were useless. They could not be used. The real threat now is not from states that understand that you cannot use these weapons without inviting suicidal response, but terrorists who do not care about suicidal response, terrorists who are prepared to commit suicide themselves. And so it is important at this point in our international history that we all come together behind this initiative that you're going to hear about to make sure that we start a process that will lead to the reduction in the number of nuclear weapons that exist in the arsenals of the world now, that will deter other nations from moving forward on nuclear weapons programs, but above all, will capture and contain the elements that are out there, the devices that are out there, the technology that is out there, the uranium and plutonium sources that may be out there that a terrorist could get his hands on to try to develop a rudimentary or a real nuclear weapon. The film features four of the most distinguished Americans I have ever had the privilege of serving with, four men who I can call my dear friends. Former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, and former Senator Sam Nunn. I think you will find this film interesting, and I hope it will motivate you to support this effort. Thank you.
It is not a theoretical question. The 9/11 Commission reports Al-Qaeda has been trying to acquire or make a nuclear weapon for a decade. Could they do that? Highly enriched uranium and plutonium, the raw material to make a bomb, is scattered over about 40 countries, sometimes under very lax security. According to the 9/11 Commission, once terrorists get these materials, a trained nuclear engineer could fashion a bomb using commercially available materials and machine tools. The terrorists who want that material don't need much of it, and there are lots of places where they could steal it.
My thinking about these weapons evolved. At first, what you're trying to do is understand, what is this anyway? And then you see pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you begin to see the horror and the inhumanity of them.
For me, the most searing question was what I would actually tell the president if he turned to me and said, I've done everything I can in the diplomatic field, and my only option now is to use nuclear weapons. Of all the decisions that were before me, that was the most haunting one.
Back during the Cold War, we basically had a period, as I view it, of very high risk. But we had stability in one strange paradoxical sense, and that is both sides knew that if there was a war, or if a conventional war became a nuclear war, that the survival of their own nation was at stake. We collectively were diligent in terms of maintaining the weapons, in terms of maintaining security. We were very conscious and sensitive to the great dangers of those weapons in most cases, and we were very good at what we were doing in terms of the professional men and women in the military, indeed on both sides. But we were also very lucky. There were a number of times that I know about, and probably a lot more that I don't know about, where only by the grace of God did we avoid going to war.
It was about 1978 when I was awoken by a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning from the general who was the watch officer at the North American Air Defense Command. And he told me that his computers were showing 200 missiles on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. Now, that, of course, was a false alarm. The point of that story is that the danger of a nuclear war, the danger of a nuclear holocaust, was not academic to me. That experience in particular brought it very close to my consciousness.
Now, most people would assume that cannot be, the Cold War is over. Are we still in this posture? The answer is we are. The number of weapons on quick launch on both sides is something to me that is absolutely ridiculous, bordering on insanity. If we're not going to use them at the very beginning of any kind of confrontation, and we don't fear the other side can use them at the very beginning, then we're going to have less of a hair trigger. And if we have, let's say, 4 or 5 minutes warning now, we ought to double it. And once we get to 10 minutes, we ought to go to 20, and then to 40, and then to 60, and then to hours, and then days, and nuclear weapons become less relevant. It's awfully hard to cooperate in a true sense of the word and to be partners in a true sense of the word. It's hard to do that when you're still pointing thousands of weapons at each other with very little warning time, and when both sides fear a first strike from the other. Those things simply don't go together. So we've got to change the psychology. We've got to back off some of the concepts we had during the Cold War, and we've got to understand that the threat has changed.
That America's security could depend on Russia's early warning or command and control systems working perfectly 365 days a year is an absurd situation in today's security environment. Mistakes can and do happen, including in the United States military, where there is evidence that attention to nuclear weapons security has diminished. In August 2007, an Air Force B-52 was mistakenly loaded with 6 nuclear missiles and flown from North Dakota to Louisiana across America's heartland. No one knew where the weapons were for 36 hours. In fact, no one even knew they were missing. We've also learned that nuclear bomb fuse assemblies were mistakenly shipped to Taiwan instead of helicopter batteries. Security lapses so serious that the Secretary of Defense fired both the civilian head of the Air Force and the general serving as Chief of Staff.
The fact that we could put nuclear-armed missiles on an airplane and fly them for hours without anybody realizing what was happening, I think is a reflection of 2 factors. First of all, that we still have lots of nuclear weapons in our inventory. But secondly, our military today rightly doesn't believe the nuclear weapons are key to maintaining the security. And therefore, they don't have the same level of attention, high-level oversight that they had at one time. In a way, this is the most dangerous of all worlds, where you still have all these nuclear weapons, but you're not paying enough attention to them.
And if the existing nuclear countries cannot develop some restraints among themselves, in other words, if nothing fundamental changes, then I would expect that a use of nuclear weapons in some 10-year period is very possible.
The world has changed since the end of the Cold War. More countries have nuclear weapons and others are attempting to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. The world needs energy, and that has many countries understandably turning to nuclear power, which, unless safely and securely managed, could also spread sensitive technologies to make the materials essential to a nuclear bomb. The simple fact is, We need new strategies to deal with today's nuclear threats.
If you can learn how to enrich fuel for a nuclear power plant, you've learned how to enrich it for a weapon.
And we have seen already in a country like Pakistan, which is a reasonably well-developed country, that a whole system of proliferation was either possible or tolerated that spread nuclear technology to Libya, North Korea, and some other rogue states.
As nations like Iran and Pakistan, North Korea get nuclear bombs, then the probability increases that one or more of those bombs will fall into the hands of a terror group.
Classical notion of deterrence was that there were some consequences before which aggressors and evildoers would recoil. In a world of suicide bombers, that calculation doesn't operate in any comparable way.
And if you think of the people who are doing suicide attacks, and people like that get a nuclear weapon, they are almost by definition not deterrable. And if you have terrorists get something, then you don't even know the return address. So I think it's a very dangerous moment.
The danger is not simply more nations with nuclear weapons, but that material to make a bomb is scattered around the world. A lot of potential sources for terrorists.
No terror group that we are aware of, even if they're well-financed and well-organized, can build a nuclear weapon from scratch. But if they got the fissile material through another nation, either by buying or stealing it, if they got the right kind of fissile material, then it's not simple to build a nuclear weapon, but it is feasible.
Plans for such a device were found on computers that were part of the AQ Khan smuggling ring, a gang that we know sold nuclear weapons information and equipment to Libya, Iran, North Korea, and possibly other nations or terrorist groups. We don't know who might have those plans. We do know that nuclear technology, closely guarded during the Cold War, has gradually seeped into the global information database. The International Atomic Energy Agency says there have been more than 1,300 nuclear smuggling incidents since 1993, nearly 20 of which have involved the transfer of weapons-usable material. The director of the agency has sounded the alarm, warning that the possibility of terrorists obtaining nuclear or other radioactive material remains a grave threat, and that sometimes material is found that had not been reported missing.
We know several things. We know that the know-how in terms of how to make a crude weapon has exploded over the last 10, 15 years. So the availability of information about the science required to make a weapon is out there now. Not a piece of cake, but doable. The second thing we know is the nuclear material, highly enriched uranium, plutonium is spread all over the world. And without the material, you can't make a weapon. And the third thing we know is the terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, but not limited to Al-Qaeda, are seeking this nuclear material and would like to make a weapon. They've said so, and I believe them.
There are still a lot of bombs, or the material to make them, that terrorists could steal or perhaps buy on the black market. They don't need much. The amount of highly enriched uranium used in the Hiroshima bomb could have fit in a 1-gallon milk jug. Here's what that did.
And of course, I always had in the back of my mind these pictures of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the devastation.
I have been writing about nuclear weapons for over 50 years now. I try to apply traditional diplomatic principles to to a world with nuclear weapons. And I found it almost, I would say, impossible to do. So the consequences have to be looked at two levels. One is technically what happens if, say, a 20-kiloton weapon hits downtown New York. And that's a very small weapon.
We're talking probably about 100,000 casualties, economic losses in hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. But beyond that, the political and the social catastrophe is something that we cannot even really imagine today.
Most of the hospitals, most of the medical facilities, most of the powers, most of the bridges, most of the communications would be gone.
We all believed that a terrorist group would claim responsibility and then go on to assert that they had planted bombs in perhaps 5 other cities of the United States and were threatening to set them off unless certain demands were met. And it's almost impossible to contemplate the hysteria and the terror that would set in. You can imagine the people fleeing from the cities. The social and economic structure of the United States collapsing under that.
There's a second level, namely, what do people think happened that permitted such casualties to occur? And what will the demand of their government? And if they will probably say globally, if this can't be prevented, what's the use of any government?
Well, first I should say that the call to eliminate nuclear weapons is not new. It has been stated many times by many people.
Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
There is only one way safely and legitimately to reduce the cost of national security, and that is to reduce the need for it. And this we're trying to do in negotiations with the Soviet Union. We're not just discussing limits on a further increase of nuclear weapons. We seek instead to reduce their number. We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth.
President Reagan and Soviet President Gorbachev came close to agreement on that vision in 1986 when the two met in Reykjavik, Iceland. But disagreements over missile defense proved a stumbling block.
In our meetings at Stanford a few years ago, on the anniversary of the Reykjavik summit, we came to believe then that the idea of eliminating nuclear weapons had finally come.
We were convinced, all of us, that we could not keep asking other societies to restrain their participation in the nuclear field if we were not prepared to accept limits to our activities. So we began to look at steps that we could take to show America's commitment.
What is perhaps new about this initiative is that the 4 people whose names were attached to that are all what you might call Cold Warriors. The people who had prominent positions during the Cold War in building up the nuclear weapons of the United States.
All of us had been identified throughout our lives with being committed to national defense. And we remain committed to national defense.
We've set out to create something that's not partisan at all. That is a subject of central importance for the United States and for mankind generally.
You're talking about a process, and that process will build, if it succeeds, on itself. But even if it were to stop at some point, it would make a contribution.
The process involves a series of steps leading toward the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. The steps include securing all nuclear weapons to the highest standards, discarding Cold War practices to decrease the danger of accidental or unauthorized launch, reducing substantially nuclear forces, eliminating short-range battlefield nuclear weapons, halting the production of plutonium and highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapons globally. They would also include adopting a process for bringing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty into effect, strengthening verification and enforcement capabilities, and redoubling efforts to resolve regional conflicts. Because the path will be long and difficult, the United States must have nuclear weapons as long as any other nation or group possesses them. But the process must start now, and others must join the effort. If the United States leads and recommits itself to this vision, it is more likely other nations will join in taking the urgent actions we need to prevent nuclear terrorism and the further spread of nuclear weapons and materials around the globe. Each step is doable. Each reduces nuclear threats. Each takes us closer to the goal by building confidence and trust. Each is one that nations must take cooperatively, not unilaterally. Each helps build to a world that our children and grandchildren can live in, free of the fear of nuclear annihilation. President Obama has endorsed that goal as a fundamental tenet of his international policy.
The existence of thousands of nuclear weapons is the most dangerous legacy of the Cold War. Today, the Cold War has disappeared, but thousands of those weapons have not. In a strange turn of history, the threat of global nuclear war has gone down, but the risk of a nuclear attack has gone up. The technology to build a bomb has spread. Terrorists are determined to buy, build, or steal one. One nuclear weapon exploded in one city, be it New York or Moscow, Islamabad or Mumbai, Tokyo or Tel Aviv, Paris or Prague, could kill hundreds of thousands of people. And no matter where it happens, there is no end to what the consequences might be. So today, I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons.
Senator McCain voiced his commitment to nuclear disarmament both in his 2008 presidential campaign and again on the floor of the United States Senate.
We should stop and think for a moment, not only the perils of a world awash with nuclear weapons, but also of the more hopeful alternative, a world in which there are far fewer such weapons than there are today, and in which proliferation, instability, and nuclear terrorism are far less likely. A quarter of a century ago, Ronald Reagan declared, "Our dream is to see the day when nuclear weapons will be banished from the face of the earth." That is my dream, too.
Over the long term, we need to be heading towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And over the short term, we need to be taking the steps to reduce the danger that the nuclear weapons we already have could be used. This is such an important problem in my mind that it dwarfs all other considerations. And I have myself decided to devote the balance of my career to working to achieve that goal.
I believe that we need a vision. We need a vision of a world without nuclear weapons. It's going to take a long time to get there. There are all sorts of steps that we have to take to be able to even move toward that vision where we make nuclear weapons less relevant, where we prevent their proliferation, and where we eventually end them as a threat to the world. That vision is essential to build the cooperation we need from countries around the globe in terms of taking the steps we need to prevent a nuclear nightmare. So the vision and the steps, in my view, go together.
We have always insisted on saying, let us test each proposition and see how it actually works and see whether it can be made to work. And we have not come to a point yet where one would say it's unworkable. And that I consider great progress.
More states are acquiring nuclear weapons or developing the technology to build them. And as we have seen, a terrorist organization would need no more than one or two of those weapons or the material to make them to throw our planet into chaos. The danger is very, very real. We are at a nuclear tipping point, and the actions being taken are not adequate to the threat.
We cannot uninvent nuclear weapons. We cannot repeal E = mc squared.
The way I view it is that if you view the goal of getting to zero as the top of the mountain in terms of nuclear weapons, then we can't even see the top of the mountain today. We're heading down, we're not heading up. It's going to take a long time to see the top of the mountain, but I think we have an obligation to our children and to our grandchildren to build paths up the mountain, to get other people to go up the mountain with us, because this cannot be unilateral.
We don't quite know what the mountaintop will look like. We don't quite know how to get to that mountaintop. And we won't make any proposals that we cannot justify, but we are determined to go up that mountaintop.
If we don't give them that hope, those of us who've been through the Cold War, if we don't give them that hope and that vision, then it's going to be extremely difficult to prevent the kind of nuclear nightmare that is looming on the horizon.
A man named Max Kampelman, who had been my counselor when I was Secretary of State, made an eloquent statement emphasizing the importance of talking about what ought to be. If you're constantly mired in what is, and you never look at what ought to be, you're never going to really get anywhere. And he used the Declaration of Independence as an example. All men are created equal. In 1776, are you kidding? We had slaves. Women couldn't vote. You had to have property in order to vote. We had the ought up there. And gradually, over time, often with a lot of pain and agony and difficulty, but gradually, the is has come closer to the ought. And we ought to have a world free of nuclear weapons.
Once nuclear weapons are used, we will be driven to take global measures to prevent it. So some of us have said, let's ask ourselves, if we have to do it afterwards, why don't we do it now?
Here's what you can do now to support the essential steps that will help prevent nuclear terrorism and the spread of nuclear weapons, and ultimately end them as a threat to the world. Show this documentary in your community and discuss it with your family and friends. You can order it free at nuclearsecurityproject.org and get the latest information on the Nuclear Security Project. Engage your members of Congress and your senators. Explore their views and share yours. Act now for a safer world.
So thank you very much, Sam and Joan and the Nuclear Threat Initiative for this extraordinary documentary. And the conclusion of it is we should discuss it, and so that's what we're here going to do. So let me, there's so many positive things to be said, but I think we'll have a more lively conversation if we have some, at least see where differences are. Last night, those of you who were here in the forum heard our colleague from MIT, John Deutsch, on the energy challenge and why we've been not very successful for 4 decades in coping with it. After Senator Nunn and the other 3 who are alternatively called from time to time, I call them the 4 horsemen. Others call them the 4 statesmen. Some of them call the 4 wise men. But in any case, these 4 extraordinary Americans, after they published this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in January of 2007, a stir began. And the stir that's still stirring the whole, I'd say, national security community. One of the responses was written by our colleague John Deutsch and Harold Brown, another Secretary of Defense. And the title of their piece in the Wall Street Journal was called "The Nuclear Disarmament Fallacy." And here's what they say. They say, the goal, even the aspirational goal, of eliminating all nuclear weapons is counterproductive. And then they have a bit of argument, and they say, hope is not a policy, and at present, there is no realistic path to a world free of nuclear weapons. So what do you say about that, Senator Nunn?
Also in that article, my good friends Harold and John Deutsch, Graham, said that, of course, we adhered to the obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty or something of that, which of course include Article 6, which basically we signed up to and all the nuclear powers did, that we would step by step get rid of nuclear weapons. And the second part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is now being reviewed, and David is covering it in New York as we speak, is that countries that did not have nuclear weapons would not develop them. That's why we are so upset about Iran and North Korea. And the third part was that everybody would have nuclear technology. So in that article, both John and Harold, and they were terrific friends and great public servants, nothing but praise for their great careers, they basically acknowledge our obligation under that. And that directly contradicts what they said about don't even have an aspirational goal. But the part where they said there's no realistic path to a world free of nuclear weapons, my answer to that is exactly, that's why we have put the steps and the vision together. The Non-Proliferation Treaty did not have steps. It did not have a realistic path. And that's one of the great difficulties about moving up the mountaintop, as we say, because you have to have tangible things that can be done to build trust, to build confidence, to build verification procedures, to build the political will to enforce, which is sadly lacking now when countries do not meet their Non-Proliferation Treaty obligations. So what we are trying to do is provide that realistic path. We may not have every step that you have to take on there, and the hardest step of all was the last one you saw on the screen where it said, redouble our efforts to resolve regional conflicts, because as long as you have the regional conflicts, whether it's the Middle East, or whether it's Northeast Asia, or whether it's India, Pakistan, or whether it's Russia and Europe, where Russia still does not have any meaningful role from their perspective in the Euro-Atlantic security arc. All those things have to be addressed. So what we're trying to do is combine the vision and the steps, and the part where they said there's no realistic path, that's exactly what we're trying to address.
Okay, and let me, David, get you into this. You came today from this wonderful event that occurs every 5 years called the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. Now, this could quickly get down into the weeds for the policy wonks here, but this is a meeting of representatives from the governments who are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which includes almost everybody. So It doesn't include India, Pakistan, Israel, and
North Korea didn't show.
and North Korea doesn't show up. But at the meeting this morning, or was it yesterday morning? Yesterday morning, President Ahmadinejad from Iran showed up, and he gave the Iranian presentation. And then I think Secretary Clinton spoke from the U.S. perspective. If you came to this group assembled, most of whom come from the so-called NAM, the non-aligned members, and you said, here's our idea. We're going to embrace the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. Are they closer to Senator Nunn's view or to Deutsch and Perry? What do you think?
Well, the non-nuclear states, who vastly outnumber, of course, the nuclear states, would say, terrific vision, so you folks start by getting rid of all of yours, and then we'll talk about not building ours, which, of course, is not the pathway that we've all been discussing, because the difficulty here is you can get rid of weapons, but you can't get rid of knowledge. And so the concern is, how do you build down in such a step that you also create the reassurance that you're not going to need the weapons? And all of the hardest steps here, of course, are the last ones. And yesterday, as part of this process, Secretary Clinton announced and the Pentagon released a set of numbers about how big the American arsenal has been over the past, since 1962, I think were the numbers that they turned out. And it was a fascinating chart. I wish I had brought it here today, but it showed a huge increase in the 1960s, from basically the end of Eisenhower through Kennedy, through the Johnson administration, peaks in 1967 at 33,000 nuclear weapons. Comes down some during the Nixon administration, not much, then down a little more, takes a little leap up in the Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter time, is completely flat during Ronald Reagan's time, which is sort of interesting given the image that the United States was breaking the Soviet Union by in an arms race. And then goes down again under the first President Bush, levels out completely level under Bill Clinton, and takes a drop under George Bush. It's significant. It's continuing today. And we're now down to about 5,000 that are not, that are either prepared to go or in active reserve. And that takes us back to basically where we were in 1957 or 1958. And the hard part now is to make that last leap down. And I think that's really what the documentary was all about. One should have about zero expectations for the conference that's underway in New York right now. The first thing you need to know is that all 189 countries need to agree completely on any change. These are countries that couldn't agree on what time to break for lunch. So, it's going to be difficult in that regard. But the second, I think, great impediment is going to be that President Ahmadinejad actually had a fair number of people who I think were sympathetic with the position that he took yesterday, which basically started with, why are the largest nuclear powers lecturing to countries that he argues in his case has not built and has no intention of building weapons? And that makes it hard to build consensus, particularly when you are an oil exporter.
Sam, let me get you to go, because on the question, so what and how does the agenda, the vision and the agenda, connect to something like Ahmadinejad's interest in nuclear weapons? And sometimes when people are arguing about the vision, the proposition is said, well, if the U.S. were to eliminate credibly all of our nuclear weapons tomorrow, so if it were possible, and we could verifiably eliminate all of our nuclear weapons tomorrow, do we think that Ahmadinejad or Kim Jong-il would think nuclear weapons were more interesting to them or less interesting? How does the linkage work here?
Well, first of all, you're not going to eliminate the U.S. arsenal of weapons or even get down to very, very small numbers unless other countries that have nuclear weapons move in that direction, and unless countries like Iran and North Korea give up their nuclear programs, and unless you have both verification and the political will to enforce. Alexei Bartov, our colleague in Russia, who's on our foundation board, and a very much of an astute observer of this and scholar on the subject, was asked by a Russian reporter not long ago how he visualized a world without nuclear weapons and how could that possibly be possible. And he said, we're not talking about today's world minus nuclear weapons. We're talking about changing the world, and that's what you have to do. You're not going to simply deduct nuclear weapons with all the tensions all over the world and declare that the problem is over. It's just not going to happen that way. You've got to work the regional issues. But when you consider, and you can put a discount factor on this or whatever you'd like, but there was a recent article about a magazine, I believe it's called American Scientific Magazine, and it basically had taken supercomputers and done a simulation of Pakistan and India having a nuclear exchange involving 100 weapons, 100 nuclear weapons. And they basically determined in their model that about 20 million people would be killed. But beyond that, that it would cause so much havoc in terms of the atmosphere and have such a cooling effect, blocking the sun, that over the next few years, 1 billion people on the face of the earth would starve to death because of the climate change. Now, we're talking about thousands of weapons we have now. As Kissinger said, we're not sure where all the roadblocks are. None of us can absolutely see the top of the mountain. But what we're saying to the younger generation, and those of us who've been in this Cold War for a long time, is that the threat has changed. The U.S. and Russia have more in common now in terms of the threat than we have in terms of separation. We're not going to deliberately, nor are the Russians, in my view, going to deliberately start a nuclear war. But we've got to get over the Cold War mentality and begin to work together. If the U.S. and Russia, with 90-95% of the weapons, don't lead the way, other countries, China, Britain, France, and others, are not going to deal with this. So we've got a long way to go. But we do believe that, I believe firmly, that without the vision, you're not going to have cooperation. Without the vision. Because the vision is our non-proliferation treaty obligation. I mean, that's what we signed up for. It's not like we pulled it out of the air and we sat down and under a stump said, here's where we go. We've signed up for this in 1968, and so did every other country virtually, except India, Pakistan, and Israel. So we basically, without cooperation, we can't protect America. We really can't protect America. You cannot get nuclear materials under control without cooperation. Without the vision, you're not going to have the cooperation. And without the steps, you're not going to be able to protect America. So the vision and the steps go together. And even if we did not have the goal of getting to the top of the mountain, even if we said we're never going to get to the top of the mountain, we're going to get to base camp, every single one of the steps has to be taken to protect our security. And the question is, that Brent Scowcroft and I have had differences of opinion on this. He's another great public servant I admire. But Brent's view is that basically the vision makes it harder to get cooperation on the steps. My view is opposite. I believe Iran and North Korea are not going to give up their nuclear programs because the United States and Russia have a START treaty, or even if we go to lower numbers. I do believe we've got a much better chance of getting other countries that we have put pressure on North Korea and Iran and other countries who may have those aspirations if they believe that we are living up to our commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I think the vision is very much important in terms of protecting our own security, because it's essential if we're going to get people to take the steps that we need to secure nuclear material around the globe, to begin to have a fuel cycle that is under safeguards wherever it is, whether people are reprocessing and making plutonium or whether they're enriching and having highly enriched uranium. In my view, all of that has got to be under safeguards and to bear down on these regional issues. Another example, Pakistan is not going to give up their nuclear weapons as long as India and Pakistan look like they are going to go to war. But if 100 weapons can kill 1 billion people, if that happens, or even divide it by 2 and give it a discount factor, doesn't the world have a stake in what happens between India and Pakistan? Doesn't the world have a stake at what happens in the Middle East? Doesn't the world have a stake as to whether Russia feels that it's got to rely on tactical nuclear weapons because of NATO and because of other security problems. Can't we address those problems and deal with them? I think we can, and I think we must. And if we're going to have a world that our children and grandchildren have a chance of getting to base camp, let alone see the top of the mountain, we've got to stop now. And if we're going to start now, and if we're going to have a consensus in this country and not have this become a political football, the four of us felt it was essential that 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, all of whom had been through the Cold War, all of whom believed in a strong national defense and still do, that we come together and try to create the political space so young people that we have gathered here and other young people in this country and around the world can begin to say, hey, there's hope here, there's a chance, and our generation has a chance to do something about it. So that's the logic here.
Let me, David, get you to comment on the thing we were actually discussing at lunch today, which is there any other area in American politics in which 2 such iconic Republicans and 2 such iconic Democrats agree about something that is this bold?
Hard to think of one. I mean, back 15, 20 years ago, that happened more on the deficit than you see today. But certainly not on something, I think, at this level. You know, the deficit, obviously a severe issue for our future as well. But I think what has given the movement that Senator Nunn is representing here today such momentum has been the very fact that it is 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans who would disagree on many issues in American foreign policy. I think the other thing that has given this great momentum is that once the administration changed, President Obama, even as a candidate, endorsed the basic outlines. I'm not sure that he signs up for each and every specific, but endorsed the basic outlines of this. And that was highly controversial within his campaign, or so many in his campaign told me at the time. I had the chance to interview President Obama just before he announced the new nuclear strategy 3 weeks ago. And it was sort of interesting because he follows through the same logic that Senator Nunn just took us through, which was that if the U.S. didn't build down, you couldn't build the confidence of other countries. But he's very quick to emphasize, sort of in his first sentence, this isn't going to happen in my lifetime. And that is an effort from him to try to insulate himself from what he sees as coming a big fight with many in the Senate in particular about the specifics he has, starting probably with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which he wants to get passed, and they were telling me they would do it this year. They're now tossing that to a future year. And I think he's finding that even the first small steps, we haven't conducted a nuclear test in more than a decade, are going to be huge battles within the U.S. before you even get to the next steps that Senator Nunn's described.
Sam, let me ask you another one that comes up as this gets debated. So I think what's brilliant about the whole program is the notion of trying to marry a very pragmatic set of steps with this much bolder vision, which in any case, as you say, we accepted as a treaty obligation, and every president since we signed the treaty has said, yes, this is the law of the land. And the Constitution says if a treaty is signed and the Senate ratifies it, that's what it is. But so you have this combination, but if we look at kind of the trend lines, let's say for the last decade, Iran used to have 0 centrifuges, no enrichment. Now 4,000 centrifuges spinning. LEU, enough for 2 bombs, North Korea used to have no nuclear weapons, now 10 nuclear bombs and 2 tests. Pakistan tripled its arsenal in the past decade while the state has become less stable. Al-Qaeda, as Ralph's chronology, seriously seeking and had another decade to keep. So we work through this list. We see a lot of rather negative trend lines. So I worry that before we get even to the next base camp with the agenda, this avalanche is going to come, and a bomb's going to explode somewhere, and we're going to say, as you all said in the movie, I guess Henry said, well, the day after that, then all the parameters that now seem like political constraints may look quite different. Indeed, I think Kissinger said, citizens are going to say, what the hell do we have governments for if they don't protect us from something like this? So how, as you think about the trend lines, do you put this package together?
Well, there's no doubt there are potential avalanches building on the top of the mountain as we try to turn around and head upward rather than downward. There's no doubt about that. And Iran and North Korea are two of them. The proliferation of enrichment is another one. The proliferation of knowledge, which we're not going to repeal, is another one. The nuclear materials that are not properly secured is another one. The lack of basic safeguards surrounding plutonium reprocessing and enrichment is another one. But let's look at the other side of the ledger. We've had, I believe it was John F. Kennedy, that said that we would probably have 20 nuclear states within 20 years. Don't hold me to the exact number. We don't have that many. We're about half that many. There were 4 countries that had nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union broke up. Russia, of course, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. 3 of those countries gave up their nuclear weapons, 3 of them. Kazakhstan and Ukraine had more nuclear weapons than China, France, and Great Britain combined, and they gave them up. That was under the program that the broad auspices of the non-Lugar program. Actually, U.S. and Russia have reduced by about 75% the nuclear arsenals we had at the peak, as David said. South Africa gave up a nuclear program. South Korea and Taiwan both gave up the nuclear program, or largely gave them up. There's still experiments going on in places. So there's hope here. To give you one other sort of parable of hope, particularly to the young people, the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union broke up, 3 of the 4 countries gave up their nuclear weapons. One of them, Ukraine, got a proportionate share of the monetary value of the highly enriched uranium, which was blended down, and the Russians entered into a 20-year program of us buying the low-enriched uranium, which was in high-enriched uranium that was in warheads on missiles pointed at us during the Cold War. And we bought that over a 20-year program. That's an ongoing program. If you look at the electricity in the United States, 20% of it is nuclear, 20% of electricity. If you look at the nuclear fuel going into the production of that electricity, 50% of it's coming from the highly enriched uranium, blended to low-enriched uranium, made into nuclear fuel that is now burning the light bulbs of our country. So 10%, 1 out of every 10 light bulbs and every other form of electricity is coming out of warheads that were aimed at us during the Cold War. That hadn't been that many years ago. So there's hope. There's hope. Is there a big, tall mountain up there? Yes. We got a lot of rocks that could turn into avalanches? Yes. But if you look at the avalanches coming too, there's one other thing that I would point out. I think it's slowly but surely, strike surely, it's slowly but cautiously dawning on a lot of people in Russia and the United States that we have more in common in terms of threat. It's not just the United States that has a threat of a nuclear explosion. It's probably other countries as much or more, and Russia's one of them. But there are many. But if you look at the great powers on earth today, Russia, United States, Europe, Japan, China, and Japan, there's more in common now on security than there ever has been, in my view, and at least in modern history, perhaps in history. So we've got a lot to build on. We have we have huge advantages in technology. We can verify things now, and there's a possibility that's going to grow by leaps and bounds that we could never hope to verify before. We can put cameras, live cameras in missile fields. We could take a lot of weapons off of prompt launch, and we could verify that. There are ways to do it. We just have a START treaty that's been agreed on that renews the hope of verification. It's a modest treaty in terms of reductions, but it's a big treaty in terms of symbolism and psychology of verification, which is The only verification we have is in this new treaty. So there's hope here, Graham, but I will acknowledge that there are a lot of problems.
Good, good. I think that's good to give us some balance. Let me turn to the audience now. There's an opportunity to put questions or comments. There are 2 microphones on the ground floor, and there's a couple of microphones at the lodges. Let me tell you, remind you of the ground rules. So please identify yourself, make your point or put your question briefly, and the question ends with a question mark. We have only 2 speakers tonight, so these 2. This gentleman is first.
Reg McKean of the Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement. And my question is to all the panelists, including Graham, Allison. Is the Obama administration, now in its 16th month, doing enough in these areas? I'm interested in a whole range of areas here, but I'm particularly concerned with quick launch. Thank you.
My answer,
this is Mr. Quick Launch.
I'll take
yes.
the quick launch here, or prompt launch. My friends in the military tell me not to use the term hair trigger, but I think people in America understand what that is. It means you can shoot very quickly. And if we shoot quickly, or the Russians shoot quickly, then it means the other one has to match that. And so what the idea is, as I mentioned in the film, if you have hypothetically 6 minutes warning now, if you can devise schemes, it would take a lot of military-to-military contact, it would take laboratory work, devise ways of having both countries move away from having so many weapons on prompt launch, reducing the numbers. I think it would reduce the chances of accident or miscalculation or false warning. We have an existential stake in the Russian warning system working properly. If it goes wrong and they make a mistake, we are the targets. Now, they have an existential stake in ours working right. So I have, for a long number of years, felt that one way of moving away from reliance on nuclear weapons is for the 2 countries that have 90-95% of the weapons to move a lot of weapons off prompt launch. That doesn't mean you wouldn't have a residual capability. Unfortunately, the nuclear posture statement did not address this issue in a positive way. And it perhaps was a compromise. I have no idea why it's in there, but they basically took the position that if you took weapons off of prompt launch, that once you got into a crisis and started putting them back on, it would escalate the tensions. I've heard that argument for years. I think that is a very questionable argument. That means that if you take that argument, you basically would say we're riding a tiger that we can never dismount. I mean, you really are conceding that you can never get off of that. And besides that, I don't know whether there are not many in this room old enough to remember when somebody asked General Hal Haig when he was head of NATO what he was going to do to show that we were serious if we got into a confrontation. He said, well, one way we could do it is to fire a weapon straight up in there and let it explode. Well, you need signals if you're in a period of tension of being able to show seriousness of purpose without having to pull a trigger. So if you had weapons that weren't on prompt launch and you said we're going to put some of them back on prompt launch, sure, it's an escalation, but the underlying problem is already there. So long story short, the nuclear posture review, in my opinion, maybe from a compromise, maybe the Pentagon insisted on it, they put in there the same argument I'd heard before, which I've had a lot of off-the-record discussions with my military friends, and most of them will acknowledge that's an extremely weak argument. So we did not make progress on that point, but I think overall I give good marks to President Obama. I think the nuclear security conference he just had put the premium on what Graham has written about and what our foundation has worked on, securing nuclear materials. One of the countries we wanted to get rid of highly enriched uranium, Ukraine, did that. That's a big step forward. Some people belittle it. I think it's a big deal. We need Belarus and South Africa to do the same thing. There's some movement on South Africa. Mexico basically took positive steps. Chile took positive steps. So there are a lot of good things coming out of the summit. I also think overall with the nuclear posture review, it moves in the right direction because it does say clearly, in my view, that the threat has changed, and it does say clearly we are reducing reliance on nuclear weapons. So I give it overall good marks, but on the particular question you asked, I would not give it a good grade.
David, do you want to come in?
Just a couple of added points. The Obama administration makes the argument that they have taken 3 separate and related steps that they've been trying to move on since the president's speech in Prague that you saw on the screen. One of them is the START treaty itself, which was just signed with the Russians. A step in the right direction, but it's not much of a reduction at all. And I think the much more difficult question is, what's going to be the next START treaty, and will there be another one? Because I think the next cuts would be much harder for the Russians. The second is the Nuclear Security Summit that Senator Nunn has referred to. It narrowed the topic matter quite dramatically so that they could assure a fair bit of success. And the way they narrowed that was by saying right away that the only subject that they were going to go deal with was loose nuclear material, something that everybody can agree needs to be cleaned up. But that avoided harder questions like the fact that at the time that President Obama is talking about reducing the amount of nuclear material, in fact, India and Pakistan are producing more. So it avoided difficult issues like that. You've never heard President Obama mention Israel's nuclear arsenal. I probably, whenever we write on nuclear topics, I probably only get 200 or 300 emails a day on that subject from various people. The third thing that he's done with this is the nuclear posture review that Senator Nunn referred to. It did, for the first time, acknowledge that the threat has changed. It had 2 other elements that I think are probably worthy of study in places like this. The first is that it took the position that the United States will never use a nuclear weapon against a non-nuclear state, even if the United States is attacked first, say with a chemical or biological weapon and so forth. There's a small loophole for biological that they wrote into this. But there was an exception. It has to be a non-nuclear state that is in good standing in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was the Iran-North Korea exception. And when we asked the question, who makes that judgment? The answer was the United States itself. So President Ahmadinejad said yesterday, well, the United States is threatening Iran with nuclear attack. So President Obama intended this as an encouragement to get Iran into compliance. The Iranians say it's the reverse of that. It's a threat. I think the second thing that has to be studied here is the president's great interest in prompt global strike, a non-nuclear, very accurate weapon that could replace nuclear weapons. It makes some countries feel as if they are as vulnerable as they would be to a nuclear attack.
Well, could I say one thing?
Please.
I agree with David completely about the dangers of India, Pakistan, and the Middle East and so forth. I think that's he's dead right on that. I would say, however, if you were going to deal with those questions, Pakistan and India and Iran, and so you wouldn't do it having 46 countries come to Washington.
Much less 189 in New York.
It's a different set of, it's an extremely important set of problems, but you wouldn't deal with it in that particular forum.
Let me call next on Paul Doty, who's the founding director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and whom we're glad to see looking so healthy. Paul.
I think that in Sam's first comments, he covered so well the hard work that lies between now and not as far as a nuclear world, but a environmental change that would allow us to argue on the basis of a few megatons, should they be kept or should they go. So I don't know how to make the point, but the Gang of Four has given an enormous popular boost to the goal. And the gap lies in that, although the very strenuous efforts to indicate how we might proceed, it has not kept had the bang on the popular attraction as the single word of goal. If you Google a nuclear-free world, you get 2.6 million responses as part of the culture. But how to get there is still, despite the clarity with which the Gang of Four has made this point, still far behind the rest. One way, I'm far into retirement now, but one way would be to put aside the mountain climbing metaphor and through the clouds to the discrimination that there's really four different giant impediments to reaching what we're talking about as the goal. And one of these is the bringing down with the Soviets to a near minimum deterrent. That's enormous. Much of the public thinks, well, we've gone down 85% from where we were at the peak of the Cold War. It's only 15% more to go, but that's such a falsification of the difficulty that we have to bring down this enormous impediment that still confronts us. And with all the compliments to the news from Moscow, it's still, most of that is there. So that actually you have that group of things to get the Russians to join us in real reductions. Then you have to get the rest of the world enthusiastic about this and what has to be done. And it isn't just the problem of Pakistan. Even our NATO friends in France are pretty much digging in their heels. So there's a world political conversion that has to be undertaken as the second group of impediments. And then in some decades, we got to the point of only a few megatons around. The political environment will be so different that it is almost a waste of time to try to predict now what we should do then. And instead, I think that the magnetism that has pulled the public into focusing on nuclear-free world is blocking the concentrated effort to become persuasive of the amount that has to be done with the Russians on the one hand, worldwide with the other. And so instead of climbing up the mountain through the clouds, I think you have three mountain ranges
Get over the obstacle
to cover.
Okay.
Sorry to be so long.
What do you think of that, Sam?
Well, I think that without the vision, you're not going to get cooperation. And I think we're in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. And if we do not let the world know that we're serious about our non-proliferation treaty obligation, and that that's the direction, and that that's the goal, even though it's a long, long way off, and that we have to have a lot of steps, then I just don't think you'll get the cooperation. You won't get it on nuclear materials, you won't get it on fuel bank, you won't get it on safeguards, you won't get it on supporting the IAEA, you won't get it on the whole fuel cycle. You're just not going to get it. Now, does that mean you're going to get that cooperation because you have the vision? No, but it'll be more likely. It'll be more likely. It helps in that regard. And it also gives people some hope. Hope is pretty important. It's pretty powerful. And when you realize that we have the basic ability today to destroy God's creation, we do. And we have the ability to basically block out the sun with even a bad mistake between nuclear powers that wasn't even intentional. And two countries, not even the U.S. and Russia, would have that ability, and that billions of people's lives are at stake, then, you know, it's an awesome responsibility. So I think taking your treaty obligation seriously is important if you're going to lead the world toward cooperation.
This gentleman.
Good evening. My name is Alexander Rasalimo. I'm president of a think tank, the Center for Security and Social Progress. My question deals with deterrence and response. Let's suppose that terrorists unidentified unknown detonate a nuclear device on US soil. Let's also assume that by analyzing the fallout and radioactive spectrum, we can identify unambiguously the country from which the highly enriched uranium or plutonium came. My question is, what do we do? Do we retaliate? And if so, against whom? Maybe a country. And using what means? How?
Well, don't ever discount the possibility it could come from us. I mean, you certainly don't want to put anything on automatic. You could have the highly enriched uranium come from the U.S., it could have come from France, it could have come from Japan, it could have come from South Korea. So this is not the kind of subject you say, here's what we're going to do. You basically try to begin to develop forensics. I mean, that's one of the challenges where you need cooperation. We need to have an identification, and there are ways of doing this scientifically, so that every nuclear stockpile in the world, number one, is declared. That's where we start with transparency. I think one of the great themes we've got to have is transparency, and that includes, but is not limited to, verification. They started, David, with the numbers of nuclear weapons. We need transparency on how much material everybody has and what kind they have. Now, how long is that going to take? I don't know. But that's a prerequisite to being able to deal with the whole question of getting to the top of the mountain. You've got to have a
bank of samples.
You got to have a bank of samples. That's going to take a lot of cooperation. It may be 2 decades before we get there. It may be 10 years. It might be next year. It certainly would be one of the things that would be demanded, and what my colleague Henry Kissinger said, the 2 questions. The day after a nuclear attack, what would we wish we had done? And the second question, why aren't we doing it now? Well, one of the things is nuclear forensics and a bank of data that would indicate where that material could have come from. And then you've got to decide if the country, if it hadn't inadvertently, certainly if it was an accident, or if somebody inside of an organization sold the nuclear material without their governmental approval, you're not going to drop a nuclear bomb on it. But you certainly would have to be able to enforce it. And the world has to come together on enforcement. There have to be penalties for countries that not only deliberately do something, but countries that are negligent in handling their nuclear material. All of this has to be worked, but that's the question. And then you got to think about the end game. We need people at the Kennedy School and others, and John Holdren, and the last article I saw on this subject was, what, 10 years ago? Yep. Terrific job, but we have a long, long way to go thinking about the end game. The first question you get as a politician, if you talk about a world without a nuclear weapon, you go in a barbershop, and the first question you're going to get is, you mean you're going to get rid of all yours, and there's going to be one in the cave over there that Osama bin Laden has? And that's maybe 2 decades from now, but you got to start thinking about the question now. What do you do in the end game? Are you going to have several countries that have nuclear weapons now that are going to retain some residual? Is it going to be a cooperative effort? Or is anybody going to have a veto over the use? Is it going to be under the IAEA? All these things have to be thought about. But to me, the direction is important, and the declaration is important, and the cooperation is absolutely essential. But if somebody uses a nuclear weapon against the United States, we're going to try to first attribute it, and second, we're going to try to hold people accountable. And certainly, in an age of suicide terrorism, holding people accountable is more difficult than it ever was before, because the most likely attack on the United States is from a group of people who are not sponsored by our government and who don't have a return address. And that's also the most difficult to hold accountable, because some of these people are suicidal by nature. So what you have to do is protect the material at its source. Make sure they don't get, Graham wrote a whole book about it, make sure that the highly enriched uranium and plutonium is safeguarded. Try to blend down every bit of it we can possibly blend down so it's not weapon grade or weapon usable. Try to stop the production of fissile material for weapon purposes and secure it everywhere it is. Stop the use of highly enriched uranium in commerce. We still send highly enriched uranium to Canada. We ought to shift to low enriched uranium. There's still highly enriched uranium nuclear reactors all over the globe. We need to get those countries to convert to low enriched uranium. All these things have to be done. But I think the vision is useful. But even if you didn't have the vision, and even if you didn't agree with the vision, all of these things have to be done anyway. Right. And it really gets down to what Brent and I have talked about. It's whether you think the vision is helpful in
motivating the
moving
agenda.
this direction. I do. And some people I have great respect for do not. But I believe that we have seen, if you look at all the endorsements we've had, there have been 13 countries where four people have emulated what we've done, former prime ministers, former foreign ministers, and so forth, around the globe. And that's spreading. The most recent was Canada. We've also had, if you look at the former national security advisors, the former secretaries of defense, and the former secretaries of state in this country, those that are still living, 2/3 of them have endorsed the vision and the steps. So there is some momentum now, and I think we're beginning to see that having the vision is very useful. I think that the conference right now that David's going to be writing articles about, I think that the United States is still going to have a lot of struggle. You're not going to get unanimous consent on anything, but I think the atmosphere when it breaks up is going to be better than it would have been, certainly better than it was 5 years ago. So, but David, the baseline I would say on one of your articles should be not just what we accomplished, but how it contrasts to 5 years ago.
So we're coming close to the end here. Let me get this gentleman and this lady, and then we'll have the wrap-up. So please, and
Yes.
identify yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Guntram Mueller, and I'm with Massachusetts Peace Action. And my question concerns strategy for getting rid of nuclear weapons. You mentioned the path of step-by-step with the attendant danger of rocks and avalanches and so on. And certainly one of those avalanches is the fact that all treaties have to be ratified by 67 senators, which at the moment includes at least 8 Republican senators, and after November might mean 10 or 12 Republican senators. The question, I mean, there's some discussion in the anti-nuclear community about maybe what we should do is not go step by step. First the START Treaty, then the Test Ban Treaty, then the Fiscal-Mitrokarov Treaty, because even for the START Treaty, the Republicans have demanded, for instance, and successfully demanded, that we have a brand new complex of buildings for building new nuclear weapons, as well as having staff on hand who are capable of designing nuclear weapons, I assume they keep their competence by designing nuclear weapons. So we're going to be designing nuclear weapons. We will have built the place for manufacture them, which brings up all kinds of questions of hypocrisy in trying to deal with other countries. And as these different treaties pile up, the demands, I assume, for ratification are going to rise. So the thought has come up that maybe what we should do is go, instead of step by step, go in one big swoop for a nuclear weapons convention. And such a document actually already exists, a draft document for how to achieve abolition of all nuclear weapons. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that question of the advisability of one or the other.
I think the only way you're going to get there is step by step, because this is not just a matter of mechanically doing things, this is a matter of building confidence. You do not have the confidence in the world now for any kind of convention where countries that have nuclear weapons, in my view, would sign up for anything like a date certain. I think that would be a debate that would take 20 years, and I think in the meantime, I'd rather be taking the steps forward and building the confidence. And besides that, once you sign the convention, and let's say the perfect world works out and you sign a convention next year and you say in 20 years you're going to get rid of all nuclear weapons, you got to go through every one of these steps anyway, because nobody's going to give them up until you go through what we've talked about up here. So I don't think we're ready for a convention. Once we're at base camp, I don't know when that would be, but 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 15, depending on progress. Once you get to base camp and you've accomplished a lot of these things and you've built confidence and you've built trust and you've built verification procedures and you've built a political will to enforce, once you do that, then you may be in a position to basically think about that kind of convention. But right now, that kind of convention would, in my view, stir up huge opposition, not just in this country, but indeed in every country that has nuclear weapons. It'd be popular in countries that don't have nuclear weapons, and the Iranians and North Koreans would applaud it. But the more they applauded, the more people in this country would turn against it.
You'll get the last question. Please identify yourself. Thank you.
Yes, and I hope it's a brief question and a brief answer. My name is Susan Scher. I run a national women's peace and security group called WAND, Women's Action for New Directions. Started here in Massachusetts in 1981. I have an office in D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia. We changed our name from Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament to Women's Action for New Directions after the Cold War, thinking that that was passed. But lately, we've been very much involved in this effort to pass START and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So the first question I have is a little one for the audience. How many of you are registered to vote in Massachusetts? How many of you would be willing to call our new Senator Scott Brown? Well, he doesn't know anything about nuclear weapons. We've already visited with him, and he said to the people who were in the room that he thinks about it every day, but he doesn't know anything about the START treaty. Our other senator obviously knows a great deal. So I think that there is a lot of momentum there out in the country for making an issue of the START treaty. My question for both of you is, I so much appreciate the vision part of this because I think that's what the people need, and they need to have less fear and more hope. But everything is so partisan right now in Washington, and it used to be in the old days that it wasn't quite that partisan when you got to global issues and foreign policy issues like that. So how do you think we could break through? I know that we have Republicans and Democrats in the Nuclear Threat Initiative, but how can the people on the ground break through this partisanship and make it do exactly what you say, which is to do it step by step?
Well, the ratification process is always very difficult because you've got to get 67 votes. That's extremely difficult. I think the Senate itself has an obligation on arms control now, particularly now that it's front and center, to reestablish an arms control observer group so that they're involved in being briefed on the discussions as they go along and not simply served up with a treaty at the end of the process. We had that during the Reagan administration. Ted Stevens and I chaired it. Bob Dole and Robert Byrd, the leaders of the Senate, actually went with us. We'd go to Geneva probably 4 times a year, wherever they were having the negotiations. So having the Senate in on the takeoff is very important, and that has not been done in a long time. Of course, during the Bush administration, we did not have much in the way of arms control negotiations. The other thing is that Will Rogers once said, and some things in American politics don't change that much, he once said that politicians are like diapers. They have to be changed often and for the same reason. We've had a huge change in the U.S. Senate. The people who are there now, most of them have never been through an arms control treaty, so there's going to be an educational process. In my view, I'm cautiously optimistic on the START treaty, but I think that the people really need to study it, they need to mobilize, and they need to let their senators know what they think. I think the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is enormously important in terms of world perceptions and world cooperation, I think that one's going to be a lot more difficult, and I think they certainly we're not going to take it up this year. But in the meantime, in reference to the stockpile and the expenditures and so forth, it is important that as long as we have nuclear weapons, they be safe, they be secure, and they be reliable. And that does take laboratories, it does take expertise. The labs have a huge role to play in building down nuclear weapons. They have a huge role to play in verification. They have a huge role to play in developing procedures for enforcement. And they have a huge role to play in dealing with our counterparts in Russia in particular, which has been interrupted in recent years, and hopefully in China and other places in the future. So the laboratories do have to be kept up. That's an important part of our security. But bottom line, I think that conversations between constituents and senators are enormously important during the verification process, and I think you need to let them know how you feel.
I'm just going to add just a quick point or two on these, because I think you get to an interesting question about the political process. I agree with Senator Nunn. I think in the end, while there may be a fair bit of noise about it, I think START probably will pass. But even if it didn't, and we have once had a major arms control treaty with the Soviet Union that didn't, I believe this one requires so little action on the part of the U.S. that probably the President could fulfill all of the specifics in it unilaterally, even without passage. Comprehensive test ban will be difficult. I think even more difficult than that will be the one that I think President Obama probably cares about the most, just based on my conversations with his staff and our interview with him a few weeks ago, which is the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, which is a treaty that would basically stop everybody from making new material. And that gets right to this question of the labs and so forth. There is a political reality about keeping the labs operating, not only in the side of building weapons, but doing exactly the kind of work that came up in one of the previous questions about nuclear forensics. All of that goes right back to the laboratories, as Rolf here in the audience and others can speak on much more expertly than I can. So if you let the labs and the expertise in there begin to decay, you run into a problem with all of those issues, including forensics, including understanding exactly what it is the Iranians are doing or the North Koreans are doing. And so it becomes a different role. And let's face it, these labs also have huge political constituencies about them. They're placed in politically strategic locations.
I think the Senate really has to understand that the ratification process in the Senate has bogged down to a great extent. And one of the reasons is the Senate does not get very involved in the advice side. They only get involved in the consent. And that's what I mean by being involved from the beginning of treaty negotiations. I mean, my advice to the Senate and to the Obama administration is try to create on this Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty at the very beginning an observer group in the Senate and also in the House. They play a role, although they don't play a ratification role, that really follows the whole process and gives their advice as they go along. I think it's enormously important. It's important the Senate as an institution. I was a Senate institution man, and I value the role that the Senate of the United States plays. But if the Senate continues to be in a position where treaties sit for years and years and years without ever being ratified, that have been signed by the President of the United States, at some point, presidents will stop making treaties. They will find other ways of doing it. And there are ways to get around treaties by agreements that do not have to be ratified. And I'm afraid that's the trend we're on. If the Senate, that doesn't mean they got to be automatic and ratify everything. If they vote one down, they vote it down. But it is important they act on it. And there's still treaties that have been sitting there for 10, 15 years now. They've never been acted on. I think that's, in the long run, very injurious to the institution itself.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end for the discussion tonight, even though there are 100 more questions to ask. I find myself in enormous agreement with Senator Nunn on almost everything, but I must say the Will Rogers line about the diapers changing the politicians, I would be happy to keep some of the politicians we had before. I think that most of the trades have not been trades up, unfortunately. And I think in particular in this case, we miss in the Senate the leadership that he exercised over so many years, but the fact that he's now making this his cause, I think is a great benefit to us as citizens. So to David and to Sam Nunn and to the NDI for this fascinating documentary, let's say thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Good, I'd keep this diaper.